Hi, I'm Patricia Grabarek.
And I'm Katina Sawyer, and welcome to the Workr Beeing Podcast.
So today, Katina, you've got an article for us. Is that right?
Yes, I do. My article today is going to be about emotional cultures at work. So think about cultures and what the culture is like. There can actually be a culture around emotions where certain emotions are more accepted and expressed more frequently. And we're going to be talking about a specific kind of emotion culture called a culture of companionate love, which is not like a romantic love, but a friendly, compassionate, caring environment is an environment of companionate love, and it has a lot of positive benefits at work.
Well, I'm excited to hear about this. I think it's, to your point, not something people talk about that often. And thinking about love in the workplace, it's usually kind of taboo because everyone thinks romantic love, but this is not it. Not romantic.
No, it's not creepy. This one's not creepy. It could be creepy, but it's not creepy. It's nice when they're talking about like affection. It's more like your coworker has a bad day and you're like, oh, like, are you okay? Do you want to talk about it? Like, it's more like showing like compassion for other people and less about like, I love you, like that.
Well, that's good. Yes. It's actually kind of funny timing because this is going to air right after Valentine's Day or like the week after Valentine's Day.
Oh, yeah. Oh, my gosh. You're right. Oh, my gosh. Well, obviously, I did that on purpose. So.
Totally planned.
Yes. So if we're talking about love in life, now we can talk about love in work, but with a little L, not weird and creepy.
Yes. No inappropriate relationships here. Just
correct.
Lots of caring for others.
Yes, correct. So that's what we're going to talk about, and we're going to talk about like what is it and how can you make that come to life in your organization if you are interested, and also why should you? What are the impacts of it?
Awesome. Well, I'm excited to hear about it.
Yes, me too. In the meantime, how are you doing?
I'm good. I'm doing pretty well. Not a ton going on as usual. That was my song of nothing's going on.
That's it. We got nothing.
Yeah. How about you? Well, you just had a birthday, so I feel like you've got something.
My birthday was lovely. We got fancy takeout, and we just basically hung out. We had like a Zoom call with friends, and then we painted a wall in my basement, which I told you about, but now we have to paint it again because our handiwork wasn't as good in the daylight as it was in the darkness. So this morning I realized it needs another coat, so I'm gonna have to go back and do that. But all in all, it was a success in terms of like it's gonna be okay. So that's a good thing. So yeah, it was a very adult birthday. Takeout, Zoom calls, and painting a wall, and that's what we did.
Well, it's a quarantine birthday is what it sounds like, a COVID birthday.
Yes,
and
that's
it's
true.
Funny because we both are February birthdays, so this is going to be, we're like the last bunch of people to have quarantine birthdays because everyone's already had them.
I know. It's very true. That's very true. Yeah, we're like, because I forget what I did for my birthday last year. I'm sure we went and did something. I can't remember what we did, but I'm sure we didn't stay in the house. So yeah, it is wild. I was thinking about this, or I was just talking to someone about this today, that so we moved to DC in July of 2018. So I didn't live here in the spring of 2018. The following spring, I broke my feet. And so I didn't go outside, and I was like in bed all spring. And then the next spring, COVID lockdown. And now this spring again, will be in COVID lockdown. So I've literally lived here for 3 springs, but I have never experienced spring.
Oh, that's so sad.
Isn't that crazy?
Yeah.
I realized that I was like, the universe doesn't want me to know spring any longer. Like something's happening. I'm like not allowed to know spring for the last like 3 years. So I was like, there's got to be spring 2022. I have to just like make it the spring of a lifetime. It's got to be the spring of a lifetime.
I think you have to go to do cherry blossom stuff next spring.
Yeah. I've never been to that.
I know. You have to. I did it once when I lived out there. I mean, I only lived there for 2 years, so it's not really saying that much. But yeah, I did it once, and it's so pretty. But it's so crowded. So
yeah.
Imagine that, like, obviously I'm assuming last year everything was canceled, and who knows what's going to happen this year, but
yeah,
probably something similar because you don't really want to be out in that crowd, but maybe next year.
Yeah, I think last year they like did it where they controlled, like you had to like get a ticket or something like that. Like they like controlled how many people were there or something. But I still don't really want to go into the city and park and all that jazz. I'll do it when I can take the train again.
Yeah.
But yeah, it is just a strange thing. I'm like, it's so weird. It just all of a sudden it occurred to me that spring has never sprung for me in DC.
That's so sad.
It is sad. I was like, wow. But yeah, so we'll just be hanging out, and same thing for Valentine's Day, since this is airing right before Valentine's Day or right after Valentine's Day. We will be just doing the same thing. We're getting like fancy takeout and whatever. And I know last year for a fact, I remember for Valentine's Day, we went to a nice restaurant in DC. So takeout time for this year. Maybe by next spring, we'll be able to experience life again.
I know. Yeah, I was thinking about my birthday last year, and Danny and I went to this like really fun, fancy sushi restaurant.
Ooh.
And it's like in LA, but it's near where we are now. So it's not near where we used to live, which is kind of fun too, because it's something we had just moved here. So it's like a totally new restaurant, but it's very hard to get in, and there's no reservations. You have to like go and you like sign your name on a list at like 5 p.m. And like there's like all these like ways to try to get your way in. There's like maybe 5 or 6 tables at the most inside. Like it's really tiny.
Cool.
And so we like got in, and it was so cool, but it's such a tiny space, and everybody's like on top of each other. And thinking about it now, I'm just like, ooh, like the food was fantastic. It was so good, but that so small.
Yeah, it's like, what's going on?
Yeah, it's weird how that like feels weird. I just think about all the restaurants that we would go to, like all these little hole in the walls around the city that are, you know, phenomenal but insanely small, where you're just like sitting next to the person that's in the other party. And how, I mean, I haven't gone out to any of them, obviously, and haven't actually attempted takeout, which maybe I should, because I have a feeling their businesses are probably suffering a lot since they don't have space to spread out even for outdoor dining.
True. No, yeah, the small places. There's a place, I don't know if it was still here when you were, or if it was here when you lived here, but it's called Nasame, and it's like a really little sushi place in Old Town. And it's similar. They have like 4 or 5 tables in there, and it's only like a chef's tasting menu. So like you're there for the whole evening when you go, and it's like whatever courses, like 7 or 8 courses. I'm like, I don't know how they're gonna stay in business. Like, people will do takeout, but like they're not gonna do like a chef's tasting menu takeout like at the price that they would pay. You know what I mean? Like nobody. That's like an experience that you're kind of paying for, not like, oh, let me go pick up like 7 takeout boxes and eat something out of you. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So I was curious about that, because their food's really good too, but they seem to still be kicking. But I don't know. We'll see. Next spring, maybe will be the spring for me. We'll see.
Fingers crossed. Fingers crossed.
Yes, fingers crossed for next spring. It's a beautiful thought. So speaking of celebrating Valentine's Day and having to find new and creative ways to celebrate it, perhaps we should talk about a new and creative way you might find love in your workplace.
You made it sound creepy with the way you said love. It's not creepy love.
I know. Actually, I realized that after I said it, that it was creepy.
You're like, love. No, not that kind of love.
No, it's like, I don't know. How would you say love in an emphatic way that doesn't sound creepy? Just like, love.
No matter what, it doesn't work. It just doesn't work.
Just like love. That's it. Deal with it. Straight
I feel like it's like
non-creepy love.
It's like love, not love. There we go. That's going to be my way of saying it.
Okay. That is also non-creepy. Okay. That's better than what I was saying. So we'll go with that for sure. So the article that I have is called What's Love Got to Do with It? A longitudinal study of the culture of companionate love and employee and client outcomes in a long-term care facility.
I'm sorry, I can't. That title. It's like, what's love got to do with it? And then like 50 more words that are totally not related.
A longitudinal study of the culture of companionate love and employee and client outcomes in a long-term care setting. It's a very long title. And it came out in 2014 in Administrative Science Quarterly, and it's by Sigal Barsade and Olivia O'Neill. Her name's Mandy O'Neill. She goes by Mandy O'Neill, but I guess her real name's Olivia. And just a little tidbit, because it felt weird for me to say Olivia O'Neill when I know that she goes by Mandy. Whatever. Anyway, so basically in this study, as I mentioned before, they're interested in the idea of emotions being part of the culture or being sort of their own culture in an organization. So we know a lot about cultures and organizations. We've talked a lot about cultures and organizations, and people really have thought about up to this point cultures and organizations being more like cognitive, like a set of like norms that people share, or the idea that people approach their work, or like how they approach their work, like how do we solve problems, who knows what in this organization, how do we get work done, like all that kind of stuff is kind of the culture of the organization. And people think about it more as like a cognitive thing. And in this article, this is the first article that ever came out to focus on emotional cultures, which it's about 7 years old now, this article. But since then, there have been a bunch of other articles that have focused on emotional cultures as a result of this one. And basically the idea of an emotional culture is that an emotional culture basically dictates what happens in an organization from an emotion perspective and tells people what kinds of emotions are normative and accepted within that environment. So if you walk into a workplace and you see a bunch of people expressing an emotion, displaying a particular emotion, acting in ways that align with that emotion, that organization would have a strong culture around that emotion. And so one big thing that this paper is doing is demonstrating that organizations can have these emotion cultures, and the type of culture they're focused on is companionate love, which is a culture that's organized around compassion, caring, and tenderness for your coworkers and for your clients, or in this case, patients.
So I hate the word tenderness in this situation, but I'm just going to fly past that.
I know. I don't like it either.
So we'll have to define it and kind of just ignore the fact that the word is weird in this. But it is a really interesting...
Yeah.
We're going to like start bringing out all sorts of love songs.
I know.
But I do really like this idea of an emotion culture. And I mean, they obviously exist. Like we could probably think of examples, but it just hasn't really been talked about as widely. So I'm excited to hear about how they define everything and what they find.
Yeah. So when you kind of walk into a place and you get a sense of its like vibe, that's kind of what this is. It's like you're looking around, like what kind of facial expressions are people frequently making? Like, is everyone smiling and looking like friendly, or is everyone like grumpy and looking upset or sad, or how, like, what's like the tone of voice that people use when they talk to each other? Like, is it a caring tone of voice, or is it like a gruff tone of voice, or like everybody kind of depressed and bored? Like, what are people's body language like towards each other? Is it more like of a caring, compassionate type of body language, or is it like a cold, standoffish? And then also thinking about how people act towards each other. So people are displaying these kinds of emotions. So it really encompasses, like, you walk into a place and you're able to kind of see, okay, people are really expressing this type of emotion a lot, or a little, and it can come out in all these different ways. And so that becomes important because that's basically part of how they measured it. They asked employees to rate the extent to which people displayed caring and compassion towards each other. They also asked patients. So this was in a healthcare setting. They also asked patients to do the same thing. They had trained observers in the culture actually making ratings of the extent to which they felt like the culture consisted of companionate love. And they also had families of the patients rating the extent to which they felt that culture. And so across the ratings, they found that people thought that this setting was one in which people really displayed a high level of caring and compassion.
I would love to know more about, well, I think this is really cool that they have all the different groups seeing it, which makes sense, right? Like if you take it out to healthcare, for looking at a retail store, like some stores you walk in and you get like a specific vibe or feeling or whatever. And maybe you'll go back to some of them because of that. Maybe you won't.
Yes.
So like customers can kind of get a sense of some of the culture based on the way that people are interacting with each other within that setting. So that makes a lot of sense. And this is probably like a next paper that we should talk about at some point. But I would be really curious to hear like what types of emotion cultures people have defined and found. Like this is like one very specific type, but I bet there's a bunch of them. And I'm curious. I just haven't read a lot about this, so I'm really curious to hear more about that. If you have any tidbits.
Yeah. So since this point, there have been several papers that have been published on emotion cultures. So there's been another paper that established a culture of companionate love in another context, but they also looked at cultures of joviality, like cultures where humor is really important and displaying like laughter and like basically using humor as a way of creating like a happier, more fun work culture. So they've looked at, they call it joviality, but it's basically humor. And then there's also a paper on cultures of joy, where there are cultures organized around feeling like joyous and excited about what's going on. There's kind of like a high energy, excited culture. So there's been a few, and then there's been some on negative cultures. So there's a paper on cultures of fear. And there's also cultures of like sadness and despair. So there's a few different types that have kind of sprung from this.
Interesting. Well, the negative ones sound sad. I'm guessing you're writing a paper, maybe using some of this.
Yes. Yeah. My paper on hope is about cultures of hope. So that's why I found this paper, and that's why I know a lot about all these papers, because I've been writing about all these papers for the last like 2 weeks.
Yeah, I figured. I was like, if she's saying there's one paper on this, one paper that, I'm like, you know, because you're really in it right now.
Yeah. Yes, exactly. And the cultures of hope thing is kind of interesting because generally in this research, people think of a positive culture as having positive outcomes and a negative culture as having negative outcomes. But what we find is that hope is a positive emotion. So you would think it would have positive outcomes, but it actually has both positive and negative outcomes. It's kind of a mixed bag. So that's kind of the fun finding of that paper. Maybe hopefully it gets published and at some point we'll be able to talk about it. But the general idea in the research right now is that a positive culture leads to positive outcomes, which is a lot of what we'll be talking about today. And a negative culture would lead to negative outcomes, which is what also has been demonstrated. So we're complicating that a little bit, but overall that's generally how it plays out.
Yeah. Well, I think hope is a much more complicated emotion anyway. So it's like it's its own thing. But yeah, it makes sense from like obviously a culture of fear. If that leads to something positive, I would be very surprised.
Yes, right. Yes, exactly. Yeah. So and not only do emotion cultures kind of immerse you in the emotional experience, but they also send messages to employees about the importance of those emotions. So it boosts like the perceived value, like it's really important to be caring towards people, that being caring towards people is key for providing whatever kind of service they're trying to provide. So in a hospital, it makes sense that might be a place where that emerges. And so because there's sort of this understanding that like this is how we want to feel and this is the kind of environment that we should be providing, there's more alignment across employees in terms of the extent to which they actually enact those emotions, because it becomes normal for people to act in a caring, compassionate way. And the more you see it and the more you feel it, the more you're likely to understand that that's what you're also supposed to do. And the more likely you are to then, you know, act that way towards others. And it kind of like becomes like a sustaining cycle.
It becomes a culture.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
So they found, so in this paper, they have, I mean, their methods are really cool in this paper. So one of the things that I really like about this is that they got a lot of different perspectives, like I was saying. So they measured the culture at time 1, and then 16 months later, they measured the rest of the dependent variables. And so they asked, so all the outcomes were measured 16 months after they got the first set of data. And when they gave out the first survey, it basically asked people the extent to which they saw other people expressing these emotions on a regular basis. So expressing caring, expressing compassion, expressing tenderness, and affection. And so they basically asked the employees about that. They also asked the patients about that. And they also asked the families of the patients about that. And they basically asked people, as I'm saying, to basically say the extent to which they witnessed people expressing those emotions. So it wasn't the extent to which you felt that emotion. It was how much do you see it? And so they're basically measuring how much does this culture manifest around people as a way of telling whether or not that culture like actually lives within the organization.
Can you define those different components? Because I know like tenderness and affection, for example, are probably not what you think of initially.
Yeah. So something interesting about this paper is that actually their measure was kind of like a checklist of words. The extent to which people had actually felt those things. And so it wasn't, it literally was like not like defined like that. It was like, like to what extent do you feel? And the words are affection, caring, compassion, tenderness. Or do you see? So it like was just basically a checklist.
So it's however you interpret tenderness.
Yeah. So to what degree do people in this division or organization express the following emotions at work? And those were the questions that they asked. And then they asked them on a scale of 1 to 5, from like never to very often, how much do you see people displaying affection, caring, compassion, and tenderness around you? So they actually did not define those terms.
That's really interesting. Okay.
Yeah. Yeah. So it's kind of an interesting thing because, you know, it would be interesting to see what people were defining those things as, or what they're watching when they're saying, yeah, that was an act of tenderness or that was an act of affection. They don't really get into that in the paper.
Okay. Well, I mean, I feel like I can envision what it might look like.
Yeah. I think in a hospital setting too, it would be a lot easier to think about like, okay, am I seeing a lot of like the nurses and doctors being caring towards patients? Am I seeing them showing compassion? Like I could see that becoming more clear. You know what I mean?
Right.
In a regular workplace, it would be interesting to see how those things play out, where there's like kind of less opportunity than there is in like a caretaking context.
Yeah, I wonder like what does tenderness or affection look like when you're not doing caretaking?
Right.
And it could be something like, I'm just thinking like, you know, affection could even just be like a pat on the back or
right, exactly.
Something like that.
They do talk about that some of these things manifest just by like in ways that people just like treat each other physically, not creepy, but like just like you're saying, like if someone's upset, are you gonna like put your hand on that person and be like, it's gonna be okay? Like what, you know, like that might be like an example of like affection towards a person. Whereas you could in a culture that doesn't have a high level of companionate love in it, you could be like just like standoffish, right? And like and not say anything, or you could walk away, or you could be like, oh, that sucks, sorry, and like and not really pay attention to it, and that would be a lower score. So I think they're kind of like banking that people kind of know it when they see it.
Yeah, that makes sense. Well,
Yeah.
again, future research would be interesting to see how this plays out in other settings and what that looks like and maybe defining it more specifically.
Yes.
But even without defining it, they saw this occurring.
Yes. Yes, they did. And so they saw it occurring, and it was consistent. So there was consistency in the ratings across different sources for different units. So they know that people are capturing something similar because all of the items were related to each other. So if you gave the unit high scores on tenderness, you also gave it high scores on affection and caring and compassion usually. So they're tapping into something similar, and across the different groups, the patients' families, the patients, and the employees, there were similar ratings for each unit. So people are capturing something that is sort of like they're saying, they kind of know it when they see it, and people are agreeing across sources and within source that these things are happening together.
Didn't you say there were some observers too? Like trained observers?
Yes, they did have observers. And they basically had 3 research assistants that assessed each unit's culture of companionate love at multiple time points. And they would then ask they were then asked to respond to the same things. How much did employees in this unit express the following emotions? And they would rate that. And they used that to also compare and make sure that those ratings were related to the other sources.
So I'm really curious, and I'm sure they didn't say this in the paper, given what you just said, but I am very curious what they told the research assistants these things meant.
Yeah, that's a good point. It says that they were trained, but it doesn't say how.
Yeah.
So
one day we'll find out.
Yes, true. We can maybe ask Segal or Mandy what they did. But yeah, so basically what they looked at was, how does this impact outcomes for employees, for patients, and patients' families? And so they looked at a lot of things. So I'm just going to go down a list and then I'll tell you what they found. So they measured emotional exhaustion in employees, and they also measured absenteeism. So the extent to which people were burnt out at work and how many days of work they missed. Mm-hmm. They also measured employees. They're calling it engagement, but they measured the extent to which they perceive a high level of teamwork on their team. So the extent to which people are functioning well as a team, which is important in healthcare. And also their employee satisfaction they measured. So satisfaction and teamwork. So those are the 4 employee measures, just to go through those. And what they found was that the employees were improved on all of these things except for emotional exhaustion. So absenteeism went down, and the what's it called?
Satisfaction and teamwork?
The satisfaction and teamwork went up.
Okay, so except for, that's so interesting that emotional exhaustion did not change.
Yeah. I thought that was interesting too.
Work.
Yeah. So it's kind of interesting. And so they did find from the outside raters that the outside raters scores were related to lower employee exhaustion, but the employees' ratings did not predict employee emotional exhaustion. So that's kind of interesting. So other people's observations of the culture had to do with the employees' exhaustion, but not their own assessment, which I don't know what to make of that. But basically, the strongest effects were on absenteeism, teamwork, and satisfaction because they were across sources related.
And I think it's interesting because teamwork and absenteeism, because of what you said with emotional exhaustion, it feels like those two are related. It's like, well, the teams work well together. Like, I'm not going to, kind of flake out on my team. I'm going to be there.
Right.
Yeah. So there's kind of like, I think those two things are probably related to each other as well.
Yeah. So basically, even though it didn't have an impact on emotional exhaustion, it may be one of those things where these jobs are so challenging in terms of caretaking, that there's some other things going on that would need to happen in order for emotional exhaustion to be really impacted. So it's not like it's having a negative impact where it's making emotional exhaustion go up or anything. It's just that there was no relationship. So it may just be that the story around emotional exhaustion in these kind of caretaking settings is a little more complicated.
Yeah, I think it makes sense. I mean, there's so much going on in these settings, and it's such a stressful environment that this can't be like the one thing that might improve it, but it seems like if it's improving everything else around it, that's a good thing, right? And it's not hurting it. So it still seems to have a lot of major positives from the employee's perspective.
Yes. Yeah. So if you, want the satisfaction and the perceptions of teamwork to go up, and you want your employees not being absent as frequently, this is a good thing from an employee perspective. From a patient perspective, they also found a bunch of great stuff. So patients were in a better mood as a result of having higher ratings, or rating the culture higher on companionate love. So they were happier. They rated themselves as having a higher quality of life. They were more satisfied with their experience. And they also had fewer sort of like really negative events, which they measured by trips to the emergency room. So they had fewer trips to the emergency room, which is an objective measure of actually them getting better from a health perspective. So not only did it make them feel better, make them happier, make them more satisfied with their trip, but there was also this like objective health outcome that was associated with being in a culture that was characterized by companionate love.
Which is huge. That's huge. I mean, patient outcomes obviously is super important for this industry. I think people that go into healthcare, they obviously want patients to do well. They're there to help. They're there to make a difference in people's health. And the fact that just having a really great culture where people care about each other can lead to patients having fewer emergency moments while they're staying at the hospital is massive. That is so big. I can think of so many clients that would love this. I just hope people actually can use it.
Yeah, I mean, patient outcomes are huge, and predicting patient outcomes can be difficult. So I think that this is a really interesting thing that, the way in which you organize your culture and what emotions people see as normal and, go out of their way to try to express is really, really important. I also think that it's important to note that it wasn't just the patients themselves that had higher satisfaction with the experience. The families of the patients also were more satisfied to the extent that they felt that the culture was indicative of companionate love. And they said they were more willing to recommend the facility to somebody else. So not only did, they have a positive impact on the patients, but also the families of the patients would be more likely to recommend it, and they felt more satisfied with their experience. So from an employee perspective, it does a lot of good, but also from a customer client perspective, it does really well with regard to the patient experience.
I love this. This is huge. And I think it's not, it takes a long time to change a culture, but it's not impossible, and it's not necessarily an expensive thing to do, if that makes sense, right? It's now people have to start changing their behaviors, start treating each other with more compassion, more care, more tenderness, affection, things like that, to move that culture where they need it to go. But it's not like you have to pay for like all these huge systems or anything like that. Like, you can make this change and start, encouraging people to behave certain ways, rewarding those types of behaviors, and getting this culture shift happening, and then have impressive outcomes both for the employees but also for the patients. And I think for this industry in particular, that's massive. But I think for any industry, whatever, if this holds true in different contexts, then obviously having customers recommend your business is huge. Having customers coming back and saying that they had a good experience, all those things are really important for businesses to stay obviously in business. Right. So I think that this could have really major impact. And I just love it because it's like, here's a wellness approach to something, a positive culture approach to something, and here's like some true tangible business outcomes that are impacted by it.
Yeah. And I mean, basically what they say, to your point of it being low cost, what they say is really important is just you need to start demonstrating these behaviors, and people who are influential in the environment need to do that. So if leaders or people who hold more power or influence in the environment start acting in more caring ways, you know, thinking about, okay, when I'm stressed, what's my go-to reaction? Am I a person that starts becoming like gruff, standoffish, or what's going, you know, or am I a person that sort of thinks, okay, you know, I might be stressed, but my stress is not going to, impact the way that I treat other people. And maybe when we're feeling stressed, I need to go even more out of my way to show caring and compassion to people. So basically that, you know, thinking about what are your emotional defaults right now, like what is the emotional culture and what do you need to switch in order to make people recognize that their reaction is this, but it could be this other more positive thing, and to get people into the habit of displaying those emotions, particularly people that are more influential, because the idea of a culture is that it has to catch on, and it's more likely to catch on when, you know, people that are doing it are paying more attention.
Yeah, I agree. And I think it's also like, I envision if I was to go into a healthcare setting right now and a client asked me, how do we change this culture? I think one would be that leadership buy-in, like you said. So get leaders involved, show them what the results of this type of culture can be, explain the types of behaviors they should be exhibiting, have them trickle that down to their team members. But I would also actually, just thinking holistically from a client perspective, like what would you do? I would also send this message to employees at all levels. So whether it's some sort of meeting, or I don't know what kind of messaging works best in hospitals, like there's a lot of complexity in getting messages out, but having people talk about this at all levels, because I think there is something to be said about leaders showing these behaviors, but I think there's also like this grassroots impact that can happen where people that are really bought into doing this and making this change will start behaving that way as well. So it's hard to be the first in your team to do it if no one else is doing it. But if other people are starting to, you know, if other people at your level are also doing this and focusing on this, then you can make a change even from the bottom up, especially because of the bureaucracy in the hospitals. Well, okay, I'm not going to say too much, but based on my experience with clients and people that I know that work in healthcare, there's a lot of bureaucracy in hospitals, for example, where there's sometimes maybe a lack of trust between the two groups, like, you know, people that are on the floor versus leadership. So I think that there could be some important impact missed if you don't start from the bottom up too.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I think that the idea is that you have to get a lot of people displaying these kinds of behaviors. So whether that's by, you know, making sure that people are more likely to attend to or are displaying those behaviors and start to change the culture around from the top down, or if you say, you know, maybe that's not going to happen, but this is the kind of culture that we want to have. This is the kind of impact on patients that we want to have. It'll make all of us more satisfied. It'll, you know, make our teamwork better, like things that we all probably want to have happen. You know, who doesn't want to be more satisfied with their job? Okay, how do we assess what kind of emotional culture we currently have? Where's the gap? And how can we realize that, like, okay, this is our current emotional default, but if we want to change it around, we need to really be conscious about, instead of responding like this when something like this happens, we could respond like this. And so kind of building into the culture an understanding of where you're at, as well as, you know, how can you make a default response or make it more likely that someone's response in a situation will be aligned with caring and compassion as opposed to something else.
Yeah, I agree. And have, like, I'm envisioning like champion nurses within each unit, right? So like each unit has like a few nurses that are, you know, brought in with HR, whoever's trying to build this initiative, and then they can spread it. Like, I think if you have really good team members, the way that the teams function in healthcare is just so unique, and having some really good voices in there, I think would make a big difference. This is huge though. I love it. I think this is a great study. Thank you so much for sharing it.
Yeah, absolutely. And just so everyone knows who's listening, if you're not in healthcare, the authors are very clear to state that there are other cultures that seem to have instituted this. So like Southwest has a slogan around love, that they have they say that they have a culture of love for the customer, love for one another. So like they have built a culture like that. Pepsi, they say in the article, uses the word love in their way that they talk about the kind of culture that they have. So other places are also able to institute these same kind of caring and compassionate environments. It doesn't need to be just in a caretaking type role.
That's awesome. Yeah. Well, I'd love to see other studies too in the future. And I know you said that some people did study this in other contexts. So maybe one day we can talk about that. Because I do think that, yeah, I'm sure there's a lot of benefits in all sorts of contexts, and healthcare just seems like an obvious place to start. But I'm sure there's a lot of positive impact. So this is great. I love it.
Yes, absolutely. Thanks so much for listening, and everybody go out there and share the love and keep the Valentine's Day spirit alive.
Yes, I agree. I love it. I love it.
I love.
But yeah, I think anyways, I think it's really interesting, and I can't wait to hear about your paper one day with the culture of hope.
Me too.
So we
Hopefully.
we will keep everyone posted about that paper, because that is going to be super cool. Yeah, so thanks again for sharing that. Love to hear from all of you listeners. If you have any questions, comments, feedback, or, just want to know more, let us know. You can always email us at contact@workrbeeing.com. You can find us on our website, workrbeeing.com. You can find us on social media at Workr Beeing on LinkedIn, Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter. And if you haven't already, you can go check out some of our courses online. So we have more content out there for you. We will link to it. And we have a free course, completely free course right now on managing stress in uncertain times. So go check it out if you need more advice or help, or want to learn more about managing the stress that you're facing. Please go look that up. So thanks for listening, everyone. The Workr Beeing podcast is hosted by us, Patricia Grabarek
and Katina Sawyer, and produced by Allie Johnson.